And I wanted to just remember more in a personal memory. We're going to be engaging in personal memories today. My first ever meeting in person with René, Noël Théophile Girard, which was in a place called Piracicaba in Brazil in 1990. Girard had been invited by some of the leading liberation theologians, some big names with which many of you are familiar. Boff, Hugo Assmann, whom several of you would have met in different meetings. Sandy, I know, certainly did. Franz Hinkelhammert, and others. I think that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, they'd begun to suspect that their paradigm for liberation theology might not have quite the, battery power. The Energizer Bunny seemed to be running low. And Hugo Assmann had bumped into René at a meeting in Buffalo and had heard him and thought, aha, now here is something really interesting that we can take further. So they'd invited him to come and speak to a closed meeting of liberation theologians, into which I got squeezed in because my teachers knew that I had read René's books, and they couldn't find anyone else who'd actually read his stuff. So, I had literally just finished my undergraduate degree. I was allowed in. And so we arrived in June 1990 at this hotel in Piracicaba for this very closed meeting, and it was deliberately closed. Hugo Assmann wanted it closed because the liberation theologians were inclined to be slightly, let's say, press-friendly people, and therefore there could be a good deal of acting out in front of the media. And Hugo Assmann wanted people to have a chance to talk seriously without needing to pose. So it was a very quiet meeting. I think we were there for a whole week with really no outside interference at all. And then, and so on the first evening, I got to meet René and Martha, whom I'd been reading René for, by that stage, 5-6 years, read everything that he'd written up to that point that I could lay my hands on. And of course, I had been absolutely terrified of meeting him because I was sort of half convinced, he's going to be one of those French intellectuals, it's going to be terrifying. I'm going to be squashed like a fly into the corner. And couldn't have been further from the truth, as you all know. He was immediately relaxed, delighted, happy. The first thing we needed to do was that something on the plane had gone wrong with Martha's glasses, her spectacles. One of those little screws had come loose. So my very first Girardian task was taking Martha to an optician to try and find a little screw loose. And then the meeting started. And I don't know whether you know anything about liberation theologians, but one of their big things was how the gospel and theology must really be understood from its Latin American participants and not listen to voices from the first world like France, let alone the evil empire like the United States. Well, René perfectly combined both examples of that which was forbidden, if you like. So I was slightly nervous, having been around these guys before and having felt as a European myself the, let's say, the force of their wrath and the true depth of my insignificance. So I was nervous not about how they were going to treat me, I was used to that, but whether they were going to give René some of the same medicine. Well, the meeting started. The agreement had been, they knew that René's languages were English and French. They'd agreed in advance that English was the language of the empire and therefore was not to be spoken. But French was regarded as a so-so, second best, but okay. So the idea was that they were going to address him in French, and he was going to reply in either French or English, depending on which was easiest to him, French mostly. Well, after about 10 minutes, it became clear that none of their French was really as good as they thought it was. And so they had lapsed back into Spanish. Even the Portuguese speakers lapsed back into Spanish, which was a perfectly good choice. It's easier to understand than Portuguese. But René had read Spanish, but he'd never actually learnt it properly so as to be able to speak it. So this amazing set of days developed in which they spoke Spanish to René for hours on end. And he replied time after time perfectly to the centre of every question they asked in French. It was astounding. Apart from that, what was astounding was the energy necessary to listen in a foreign language that you don't really understand for a great length of time. But in each case, not only to understand what was being said, but to respond exactly and gently to the centre of the question. And as the days wore on, we became aware that however stupid the questions might have seemed, his answers made us feel more intelligent than we were. And this was a truly, truly extraordinary thing. Boff, at the end, and this is something which is picked up, I think, in one of Michael Kerwin's books on the subject, Boff thanked him for the sanctity of his intellect. But the sanctity of intellect wasn't an abstract term. The sanctity of his intellect meant this capacity to arrive straight at the centre of the issue, but answer it in such a way that it diffused potential rivalry, jealousy, attitude, of which there was no shortage in that room. So that's what I think of when I think of Theophilus and an understanding of that which makes us free, the Jubilee, an understanding of the sacrifice that fulfills the Jubilee, and the understanding of what spreads out from that, how René understood it, and as a teacher, incarnated it in our midst. So that's what I remember. That's what I wanted to share with you today. And when we pray for him, let us ask that we all be blessed with a share in that sanctity of intellect and that ability to leave others